On Good Friday in 1962, an experiment was conducted. It's called the Marsh Chapel experiment, or in other words, the Good Friday experiment. In this experiment, a bunch of divinity students who had been pre-selected were given either a placebo or a large dose of psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And these, of course, are divinity students. They're trained in the spiritual arts. They're on their way towards becoming ministers themselves in the church. And so then they attended the Good Friday service at the Marsh Chapel. The students that received the placebo, the dose of niacin, well, they experienced some physiological effects. They were flushed and had a tingling sensation. But these effects didn't last very long. They were gone within about an hour. But the students that received the psilocybin over the course of the next hour started to experience some very strange things. As those who have been experienced with psilocybin can tell you, it's a very interesting sensation. There's sometimes visual hallucinations, sometimes some physiological sensations of lightening and of a weightlessness. But the big thing is this sense of spiritual wholeness, of oneness, of mystic energies. And so, as is typical for this drug, the students that received the psilocybin started feeling this incredible sensation, this connectedness, this wholeness, this mystical power amongst them. And so many of them had among the most spiritual, most meaningful mystical experiences of their lives. And those that went on to become ministers and theologians described this as one of the most important turning points in their lives. Although methodologically not perfect, this experiment definitely demonstrates the effects that psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs can have in eliciting mystical or spiritual experiences. This has great importance for us as the human race because it shows that the components necessary for mystical experiences, for an experience of the divine, is built right into our brains, built right into our human selves. And all it takes is the necessary provocation for that to take place. And in this case, a magic mushroom or, any other sort of psychedelic drug can also have this effect. Now, some who are more familiar with traditional religion, the kind that is involved in the mainstream church or something like that, may think that this cheapens the experience, that somehow robs it of its mystical importance, that somehow makes it artificial as something that's not an actual religious experience, but merely something that's going on in the brain. But I don't really believe this. I believe that this makes it all the more important. It suggests that we as human beings are spiritual by our very nature. But why is this important? Why is it that having a spiritual experience is important to humanity? Well, because it allows you to feel connected. We're not just individuals. We're not just automata that are walking around the world all by ourselves. We're connected in a way to everything around us, to the material things, to other beings, to other human beings. We have an intimate interconnectedness that allows us to be greater than the sum of our parts. If we were just individuals, we would die. We would not have the resources, the skills, the know-how, the capacities to be able to survive on our own. We would all just, die lonely and hungry in the forest somewhere. But together, we're able to pool our resources, be able to work together in order to build a society, one which can allow even the weakest among us to survive and thrive, and learn to contribute their own capacities for the greater good. Not all of us are good at building houses. Not all of us are good at, making food or anything like that. But for those that don't have these survival capacities, having a society around us allows us to contribute art, culture, science. And what's more, this sensation of feeling part of a greater whole gives us the sensation of permanence, the ability to think of something greater than our own lives, something that persists beyond our existence, that we can actually plan for a future that we'll never get to experience. There's a saying that goes basically that wisdom is planting trees that you'll never see the shade of, that you'll never experience the shade of. And it'll be your children or your grandchildren that actually experience the fruits of your labor. And by this wisdom, we see that our actions now are part of an interconnected whole. It's an investment in the future that we want and on a fundamental level for the future beyond our lives to be better than that which we're experiencing now. Now, unfortunately, few people anymore have had mystical experiences. They're increasingly rare because we live in a very rational world. This idea of spirituality has been labeled as just crazy talk or stupidity or lunacy because it's associated with irrational thought. But it's not irrational thought. It's not contrary to reason. It's something that's not accessible by reason. Because you can't really quantify, you can't really science this in any meaningful way. You can't science the idea that doing something greater than yourself has some worth. You can't science morality or ethics or anything like that. But a felt sense, an aesthetic sense of this interconnectedness, of this radical importance of our actions, contributes to a type of behavior that is pro-social, that will continue to build a society that is greater than the one we have. And labeling this sensation of oneness, of mysticism as irrational or insane doesn't diminish its importance, but it diminishes its perceived worth. Our society at this point overvalues the rational arts, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And it's not that these things aren't important, because they extremely, extremely are. But unless they're tempered and shaped with this aspect of interpersonal ethics, they're going to lead to unfortunate ends. It leads to a short-sightedness that we witness in this unfortunate capitalistic world, where we're continuing to undermine and destroy nature, where we don't have a generalized compassion for other human beings built into our society, that our experience of the world is purely individualistic. The drugs that bring this on are basically outlawed, impossible to get by legal means, by and large, and many of the rituals that cause these experiences to come on are labeled as crazy. And for that matter, in those faith groups that do practice these experiences, they're often framed as exclusionary, as being our way of doing it is the only way to do it, and anybody who does it in any other way, well, they're tools of Satan or something like that. Unfortunately, the first psychedelic revolution in the 1960s and 70s was stalled by this moral panic, by this conservative backlash which caused the war on drugs. But fortunately, this is changing. A psychedelic renaissance is underway, where folks who've experienced this, folks who know the value of these mystical experiences, are starting to experiment once again. And these drugs are starting to become legal once more and accessible to the general public. I see this as an incredibly valuable opportunity, because the more that people have these spiritual experiences that recognize the vital interconnectedness of all humanity and the world at large, the more our ethics will shift towards compassion, informed by this vital interconnectedness, that we can't negatively impact the rest of the world without negatively impacting ourselves, because we are identical with the rest of the world. And these experiences demonstrate that. My first experience with psychedelics, with magic mushrooms, was a deeply important experience in my life. It was the first time that I'd ever had an experience of spiritual oneness, and it altered my way of viewing the world permanently. My level of anxiety, which was sky high before, came down pretty well permanently. I'm still an anxious wreck, but for other reasons. And I started to view the importance of making connections with people. I was very much isolated, very much an individualist, very much thought of myself as a lone wolf. But having had this experience, I recognized just how wrong that was, how incorrect I was about the value of being such a lone wolf. I recognized that my life is with other people, that being connected, being part of a team, is the human experience at large. Although I obviously can't and shouldn't recommend this experience to everyone else, I would invite you to consider the value of it, to recognize that it's not just lunacy, it's not just being high on drugs and having a great time. It's a doorway, it's a path towards a different way of thinking of the world. And no, it doesn't need to be done by drugs. It can be accessed through numerous other means as well. Deep meditation, prayer, rhythmic dance, and breathing and chanting. There's all sorts of paths to this same goal. And it can have religious coloring, or it can be completely secular in nature. Mine was secular in nature, and although I am Christian by culture, I still don't believe in a god, like an entity god. I more believe in a god that's within, a God that's all around me, a God that is identical with the material world. In the coming years and decades, humanity is going to face its greatest challenge yet. We're facing the collapse of our biosphere. I'm listening to a leaf blower outside my window, which is contributing to it. And it's going to get rough. We're going to be faced with not extinction, but an unpleasant future at the very least. We're going to need to come together. We're going to need to overcome this radical individualism and this selfishness that our current economic paradigm teaches us as virtue. We need to recognize that we're all part of the same team, and those who are not working in the same direction need to change their ways. If you've had an experience like this, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, leave yourself open to it. Leave yourself open to the possibility that there is a different way of thinking, different way of living, and that it's not nearly as scary as it made out to be. Anyway, I make videos daily, and so if you enjoy this content, algorithmic stuff, like, share, subscribe, etc., etc., and maybe check out some of those videos, because they're probably pretty cool too. And so thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.